How are they supposed to be sure?
Thank you for your question. I believe they are handling these requests on a consistent basis anyway. I believe they're trained more than we are, or I am, for that term. If there needs to be correction, I'm happy to work with the representative and create better language as an amendment to what correction of the checklist should be. I'm happy to do that.
Thank you, Councilor Patel. Any other questions from committee members? Seeing none, we will move on to our next speaker, which is Mr. G.O.S.B. Snack from the ACLU.
I am particularly concerned about maybe how this would have an impact on the snowbird situation here in New Hampshire. Someone who, say, lives in New Hampshire and comes out of here for 4 months in Florida, how this potentially could impact them. Elections happen, during colder months, November, where a voter who's domiciled here may, during that election, may actually be living at the time or residing at the time. Say in Florida, that application would be sent to that Florida address. They potentially could be impacted because a 30-day letter may ultimately be sent at some point, say in January or February thereafter. They would return it for whatever reason because they're in Florida, and they could then potentially be removed from the list. So that's just kind of an initial tentative concern. Again, I would just like, I think, more of an opportunity to reflect on the amendment. I would just say my final thought is that I don't see a limitation in this bill to simply situations where a person is having his or her absentee ballot sent out of state. I don't see that limitation. Maybe that's the intent. It seems to me that these 30-day letters would apply, again, unless I'm missing it, and I very well could be, would apply if, say, a person is domiciled in Dover but has the address sent for whatever reason to somewhere in Cheshire County or Keene. So I just wanted to flag that. Again, if I'm missing it, my apologies. I've just received the amendment. But those are my kind of tentative remarks, and I'd be happy to circulate our final position via email in light of the amendment.
Council, if you could also, in addition to sending it by email, get a paper copy
In the file?
Yeah, that's how I
absolutely.
get it in the file.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I think I could do that by the end of the week. After I take a look at it.
Thank you. Questions from committee members? I'm seeing none. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Also signed up to speak in regards to 1770 is Daryl Perry from Liberty Lobby LLC.
Thank you. For the record, Daryl Perry, CEO of Liberty Lobby LLC, and I incorrectly marked support on that. I'm actually opposed to this, and based upon the testimony of the prime sponsor, I am even more opposed. And Representative Hewitt, I believe you had asked the question about what happens during a special election if there's a snowbird. Well, what happens if there's a special election and somebody has a vacation that they've already lined up and paid for 6 months in advance? They're in Hawaii on vacation. They request the absentee ballot, and then the clerk has the supervisors of the checklist change the mailing address. When they get back from their vacation, they would then, hopefully, they would remember or be informed that they need to go to the clerk or the supervisor and have them change that mailing address back to what their actual mailing address is, not that hotel that they were staying at while on vacation. The only 2 lines of this bill that I actually do support are lines 11 and 12 of the original bill. I'm not sure what lines they are. Lines 13 and 14, it appears, on the amendment that says, in no case shall a person's name be removed from the checklist prior to the election for which he or she has requested an absentee ballot. I think that language right there is amazing and should stay. There was the statement that this was intended to only apply to ballots mailed out of state or out of the country, but if you read the title, new paragraph, absentee voters receiving ballots outside of the town or ward. So if Let's say you live in Keene and all of your mail goes to a post office box. The P.O. boxes are in, I believe, Ward 1. Maybe you live in Ward 5. You get that absentee ballot mailed to your P.O. box. That's a different ward. They would then send that 30-day letter. So I see this as not necessarily having the actual intent that was intended for this. And with that, I will answer any questions.
Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Perry, for taking my question. Mr. Perry, you mentioned about special elections and people with planned vacations. So do you know how many weeks before a special election you can request an absentee ballot and get it into your clerk? Do you know how many weeks that is?
I do not. Off the top of my head, I'm wanting to say it's 10 days, but I do not know
So
for 100%.
I do know. So I will tell you, it's at least 3 weeks. So I would say I understand what your argument would be about people who have planned vacations, but I do believe 3 weeks before a special election or any elections would satisfy what your concern was about that. Thank you.
Further questions, Representative Buell.
RSA 657, section 4, Roman numeral 1, describes the affidavit that the clerk is required to send to anyone who files an application for an absentee ballot. And in that affidavit, the person filing sets forth the fact that that person is a qualified voter currently registered in that ward or town, that they're not going to be there for the election, and that therefore they're asking for a ballot to be mailed to them.
I believe, Representative, it also says that I will not be voting in any other election.
I'm sure it does. The question I have is, do you think that's adequate protection for the integrity of elections?
I believe so, yes. That's why I said the 2 lines that I do support are that no voter shall be removed from the checklist prior to the election that they requested the absentee ballot.
Thank you. Further questions from committee members for Mr. Perry? I've seen none. Thank you for appearing before us this morning. Also signed up to speak on House Bill 1770 is Harriet Katie from Deerfield. This is the last speaker. I have signed up for 1770. So if someone wants to pass the resolution on to me, that would be great. Welcome, Ms. Katie.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and members of the committee. I'll try to be very brief. I am a supervisor of the checklist, have been since '96, other than a couple of years. The supervisors of the checklist in Deerfield believe our checklist is highly inflated. We have over 3,800 voters registered. Well, the town's population is only 4,580, so it's kind of hard to believe that 4,580 doesn't have a lot of children. We decided, rather than waiting the 10 years, we would do a 30-day letter based on property owners. So we got the list of property owners, about 2,200. Went through it all, and if they were not on a property list, we sent them a 30-day letter. That was about 100 letters. We got back 4 people who lived with somebody else under that name but still had a Deerfield address. We got back many letters, unknown at this address, so on and so forth. We also were told by the postmaster that we couldn't put on the envelope, please do not forward it, it's against federal law. So letters are forwarded and we never get them back. So there's a glitch in the 30-day letter part of the law. Secondly, we got a father who opened his daughter's mail and was in an outrage with the supervisors of the checklist that they were going to remove her. The daughter has a different name than the family there. Turns out we get a copy of the daughter's license and it's California. Now, what do you do as a supervisor when you have a voter with a California license? So I put that to the to the Secretary of State's attorney, Bud Fitch. And I'm still waiting for an answer on that, but I'm told by David Scanlon, challenge the voter when it comes in if it's absentee. That brings me to another point. The absentee requests do not require that the person furnish a Deerfield ID. They may be on the checklist, but have moved. So they could be voting in Deerfield, in Missouri, in Idaho, wherever. Because the law requires only the New England states to notify the supervisors of the checklist if somebody registered to vote in their town. It's a pretty weak law because I've only ever had one postcard from Massachusetts saying we now have this voter registered here. So we're not being notified by other states in New England, in the majority, when a voter moves out of Deerfield to one of their towns. The town clerk, if they're on the checklist, sends them an absentee ballot. When it comes back, it doesn't have an ID. Yet the voter is required to show the ballot clerks an ID. Why is there not in the law that an absentee ballot will send a copy of the license? You know, there are some problems, and it's left to somebody who might know it to challenge the voter at the town meeting or the election. Unfortunately, there's not always somebody present who knows that voter or who would know to challenge them when the absentee ballots are open, which is usually 1 o'clock. My moderator, except in the instance of the last presidential election with over 300 absentee ballots, opened the ballots at 1 p.m. on election day. In that case, he started at 10 a.m. with 300 absentee ballots, over 300 absentee ballots. So I'm just giving you some of the problems as a supervisor that we face out there. We don't see the request for absentee ballot. In fact, in the law, no citizen can ask to see the absentee ballot list from the town clerk. They have to sit at the election to know who are absentee ballot voters. I had a former selectman and his wife who lived at Pleasant Lake moved to Florida in the winter. He took a New Hampshire residency and she took a Florida residency so they could have the homesteader tax credit. So when we got her notification, we looked to make sure he hadn't asked, so he stayed on the checklist. There are some things that I think in the law give the town clerk the authority when it should be the supervisors of the checklist. And one of them is, I believe, the absentee ballot, because the supervisors are the ones who have to keep that up to date. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for the speaker, Representative Harrington?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was wondering if we could just make use of your expertise in the supervisor's checklist to answer a few questions, please. If the way this would work, it sounds like, so the person fails to respond to the 30-day notice or doesn't provide proof, so the person's name should be removed from the checklist. What then would that person have to do to get back on the checklist?
If a person is removed, the day of election, if they show up to vote, they would come back over to us. We still have their registration in the removed file, so we can quickly put them back on. There's just that one extra step of seeing us.
Further question?
And what if they were this has to do with absentee ballots. So let's say the next time they voted, they requested an absentee ballot, that they had been removed. What would happen then?
The clerk would notify them they weren't on the checklist. And if that was done in error, to please send us a copy of their license or their proof of residency. And we put them right back on.
Thank you.
Other questions for the speaker, Representative Cody?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I didn't hear, I apologize, I guess I didn't hear what your position on this bill was.
Well, I'm not all for it and I'm not all against it, so I can't give it to David. I mean, you served with me, you know.
I did, and that's why I was surprised you didn't know.
Further questions for the speaker? I will point out that she did pass in a pink card that had no position checked off.
But I didn't see that one.
Yeah, there you go, so.
I find bills up here sometime that I'm in the majority with the agreement, but when I find a bill that I have problems both ways, I can't give you support. But I wanted you to hear, we're out there in the field having to deal with some people who get very angry when removed. It's also a very time-consuming and expensive process to send 30-day letters, and out of the, say, 100 we sent in November, December, first part of December, we received about 40 back. The rest, we have to mark them as removed with no reply.
Let's come from over here.
Those are the ones most troubling because those people get upset that you removed them, but they don't reply.
Thank you. Are there any further questions for the speaker, Representative Gay?
Yes, I'm not sure if this is legally possible, but it would be nice to know what would make your job easier. What change in this bill would make your job easier?
That's a good question.
Well, I do think absentee ballots should be applied for from the supervisors of the checklist and not from the town clerk, because it is the supervisor of the checklist that determines whether or not they're going to be on the checklist. Not that our town clerk ever sent, that I know of, a ballot to anybody that wasn't on the checklist, but they do have a lot of duties at election time that we don't have, and I think that's one we are better at.
Thank you. Further questions for the speaker, Representative Ramirez?
My question that it sounds like when I'm going in for an absentee ballot, I can go to the clerk because that office is open 5 days a week. The supervisors of the checklist are not there. And so I think it could be more difficult because they only set certain notified times.
And that might be, we have people who call me from South Carolina where they live in the winter and ask me about their ballot and stuff. They know me in town, okay? And that's the fun of being in a small town, you're known. And I have never refused to go to the office to meet with somebody to register them.
All right, I think it's clear that different towns have different procedures that might control what's going on. Further questions for Ms. Katie? Thank you for coming. I have no more pink cards for 1770. So before closing the public hearing, I will note that in addition to the speakers that you've heard here today, I have some persons who have signed in with the position. Representative Cordelli has signed in favor of 1770. Representative Nodder has signed in favor. And Maureen Ellerman from Concord has signed in opposed to 1770. Thank you, everyone who participated in this public hearing. I am now closing the public hearing on 1770. 1773, which has a fiscal note relative to campaign contributions and expenditures, was noted for 10:50. I am opening the hearing at 11:10. This bill, prime sponsor is Representative Cushing, and I understand he is here to introduce the bill. Welcome, Representative Cushing. I will note that I was provided a list of speakers prior to the hearing, I do need you to fill out a pink card. So if you're on the white sheet, I've got, you can do it afterwards, I know you know this.
No, I did, I think I did.
I think it might have just
Clean
gotten,
elections.
I got it, it just got passed up to me. So, just a reminder to everyone, if you do not want to speak on this bill, please sign the blue sheet, so then we will register your appearance. And how much was the fine that we decided Representative Porter should pay for the phone that went off while she was outside of the room?
Wasn't that lunch?
It goes to the Clean Elections Fund.
I don't even have my phone here.
Somebody's phone over there went off, I think it's somewhere. All right, thank you. Representative Cushing, 1773, welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. For the record, I'm Representative Rennie Cushing from Hampton, representing Rockingham District 21. I'm here in support of House Bill 1773. I'm a product of New Hampshire, and I can't help but reflect upon the changes that I've seen over 6 decades in the state, particularly when it comes to the issue of elections and democracy. I have grave concerns about the future of our democracy, primarily because what I see kind of the pernicious influence that money has upon our elections. If you had told me when I was growing up that it would cost over $100,000 to run for a state senate race, I mean, that may be small now for a $100 seat, I would have told you that that was crazy. And 2 years ago, when I saw the state of New Hampshire spend $120 million spent in the state on a U.S. Senate race, all I can think of is that the state of New Hampshire, the legislature, only gives $80 million a year to our state university system. And what does it say when so much money is spent and churned in our elections? I thought a lot about Granny D and kind of the courageous role that she played in sounding the alarm about the corrupted influence that money has on our political process. And I'm here today as a sponsor of this bill and an attempt to try to preserve the integrity of a citizen's legislature, of a citizen's government, and a society where what matters is not the amount of money that you have when you run, but your ideas. What this bill does is it sets up a voluntary, clean election system in our state, funded by what's called civic dollars, and provides a mechanism by which individuals who wish to run for governor, who wish to run for executive council, or who wish to run for state senate, but don't have either wealthy friends or deep pockets on their own, can have a fair shot in the future at competing in the marketplace of ideas and going out and spending their time knocking on doors, talking to their neighbors, rather than dialing for dollars in some, locked away place. This bill is the product of a lot of work. You're going to hear from other stakeholders who will explain in greater detail both the specifics of this legislation and I think amplify the need for this change. And with that, I would just end my remarks. I'm willing to take questions, although I prefer to defer to citizens in these legislatures. And I will note that I think I'm late for my 11 o'clock hearing in another committee. Thank you.
If you don't want to take questions, I think I'd rather leave it at that, because I've got people who want to ask questions, so I think we should just say there are going to be lots of other speakers to ask questions, and I'm assuming that one of those speakers will have some familiarity with the bill as it's drafted, because I answer the questions on that.
Yeah, I have that. I will defer to others. I would just say to the committee, I'm perfectly willing to come back if we have subcommittees, and I want to work with it. It's not like, I want to let the people speak.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Indicating that they are in support of the bill, wanting to speak would be Jane Armstrong.
Thank you.
Please come forward, thank you. And I understand you're from Open Democracy?
Yes.
All right, and you have written testimony, that would be terrific.
Yes. I have my testimony, I have 20 copies of the testimony and 1 copy of the report from the commission that's referenced in the testimony.
All right, so we'll put that for members in the file. And we will pass that out copies to members that are here. I'm going to start putting extra copies in the bill file because I think in the future that's going to make it easier for committee members to follow. Thank you, Ms. Armstrong.
I'm Jane Armstrong, and I live in New London. And my testimony today is I'm reading the testimony of Brad Cook, who was unable to be here and wanted to let you know what he thought. So this is the testimony of Bradford. Dear Chairman Griffin and members of the committee, I am writing in support of House Bill 1773. Some years ago, I had the opportunity to chair a legislatively created commission on campaign finance reform, which studied the issue and various mechanisms for payment for and increasing involvement in elections in New Hampshire. I also serve as chair of the State Ballot Law Commission, but that assignment is separate and distinct from issues of financing. While House Bill 1773 is not strictly a campaign finance reform bill, I believe the process contained in it, while modest in scope, would be a good first step in providing individuals the means to support candidates and an opportunity for those candidates participating to recognize the limitations of the present system and the attractiveness of alternatives. House Bill 1773 establishes a clean elections fund that will be created through voluntary donations, fines levied for violations of election laws, and interest generated by the fund and any state appropriations. The fund will be used to provide citizen financing for the primary and general election campaigns of gubernatorial, executive council, and state senate candidates that agree to limit their acceptance of private contributions. Gubernatorial candidates would limit their acceptance of private contributions from individuals to $500 per contributor. Executive council candidates to $250 per contributor, and state senate candidates to $200 per contributor. It also established a Clean Elections Board and a Clean Elections Enforcement Unit to administer the fund and enforce campaign finance laws. If you deem it appropriate, this assignment might be assigned to the Ballot Law Commission to avoid duplication of boards, although this suggestion might require more consideration of what workload that would add to the commission. On the first business day of every election year, the board would mail 4 certificates worth $25 each to every person registered to vote in the state of New Hampshire. Thereafter, the board would mail the 4 $25 certificates to persons who registered to vote before October 1st of the general election year. Registered voters could assign their certificates and send to candidates that have agreed to limit their acceptance of contributions. These candidates would then be able to redeem the certificates and funds from the Clean Election Fund. The monetary threshold limits in the bill would be adjusted annually to reflect inflation. The bill also strengthens the law to ensure the independence of super PACs and candidates' campaigns, which are suggestions worthy of consideration. I urge you to act favorably on this bill, both as a worthy proposal, but also as a means to keep the conversation alive about public financing vehicles and the need to do something about the out-of-control present system and the effects of too much money in politics. Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely, Bradford B. Cook.
All committee members do have a copy of the written testimony that was just read to us by Ms. Armstrong. That, for the record, that correspondence is dated January 15th. I always like to point out an attorney who was working on a holiday, apparently, so there you go. Questions from committee members? I'm seeing none, thank you very much. Representative Harrington, if you can answer, Ms. Armstrong, we understand that you presented Attorney Cook's correspondence.
The overall philosophy of the bill, it sounds as if it's going to set up a system where people can opt into having limits on how much they raise through what we consider normal channels, and we get public funding to augment that.
You would get the opportunity to accept and campaign for people to give you their certificates.
And follow up, the say voluntary donations and stuff, what happens if there's, you know, simply you mail out all these certificates and there's not enough money in the fund to cover the costs? Where does the money come from?
Well, I don't, one way would be state appropriations.
Thank you.
Further questions from committee members? Representative Sousa.
Yes, I've got a question on the money too. It says the income will be from fines and such, but when it starts out, if every voter has the equivalent of $100 to designate, every voter in New Hampshire plus 100, where is that money coming from at the outset?
It's coming from voluntary donations, fines levied for violations of election laws, interest generated by the fund, and any state appropriations.
Follow up, Representative Sousa.
Yeah, I was more concerned about the first time, before there are fines and before we get a lot of donations. What is
Well, I don't know if the
start of this
exact mechanism of the timing has been worked out. I think, since I'm speaking for Brad Cook, I do think that he believes this is something we need to do this. We can't afford not to. The cost of our elections now is obscene.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions from committee members for Ms. Armstrong? I'm seeing none. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Also signed up to speak on 1773 in support of the bill is Rick Borden from Open Democracy.
Madam Chairman, I only made 2 copies. I apologize. I thought I had more. My name is Rick Borden. I live in Lyme, and I serve on the boards of Open Democracy and Open Democracy Action. And I would like to, I originally thought that I would kind of line out the main elements of this bill, but much of that has been done already, and it would get rather tedious. I'd like to confine my remarks to just 3 areas that, upon casual reading of the bill, may not be quite obvious. And the first has to do with civic engagement. This bill is designed to increase civic engagement in the political process, and that's something that we badly need nowadays. In their 2016 Democracy Index, the Economist Intelligence Unit ranked the strength of our country's democracy 21st in the world, dropping it from a full democracy designation to a flawed democracy. And what has been the main driver of that? The answer, and I'm quoting, erosion of trust in government and elected officials. And I don't think there's any surprise here. We need to rebuild that trust by re-engaging citizens. There are several systems of publicly funded elections. Some involve outright grants, some involve small donor matching funds, but what sets this one apart is the use of these $25 certificates, these civic dollars that we're calling them, that citizens can contribute to candidates of their choice. I believe that this program has potential to engage people in a truly revolutionary way in politics. As a citizen, I may not have the resources to support campaigns with my own funds. I can spend my civic dollars, however, and having done that, I might even decide to canvass for the people that I found worthy. I have to study, first I have to study to find out who are the people that I'm wanting to give my civic dollars to. I might canvass for them, I might engage others in political discussion. And my new involvement can spur involvement in others. 1773 goes a step further in this regard. It actually mandates debates for participating candidates, and by participating I mean candidates who meet the requirements and participate and are eligible to receive the civic dollars. The second item is benefits of Clean Elections Board. I'm just going to call that the CEB. The bill creates a Clean Elections Board to handle the day-to-day administration of the program, but it's empowered to do a lot more than just that. It has the power of enforcement not only of the civic dollar system, but of all the campaign finance rules in RSA 664. Enforcement has been and is currently a real issue that needs attention, and this would help enormously. The CEB is also charged with creating an electronic reporting system, a searchable database for tracking the contributions and expenditures of participating candidates. And all of us, or almost all of us, I think, favor transparency in the political process, but I'm fond of saying that there is apparent transparency and there is real transparency, and what we have in New Hampshire right now is transparency of the first kind, unfortunately. Receipts and expenditures are reported, but good luck finding and summarizing the data in any useful way. While only participating candidates would be required to use the CEB's electronic reporting system, once it's up and running, it could be easily adapted for all candidates. I should mention also, and I think that's important for today's discussion, that many details of the civic dollar system, things like filing deadlines for affidavits of registration, things like this, are not addressed in the bill. That's because the CEB is charged with filling in the blanks there. It's given the responsibility, and I quote, adopt rules to ensure the certificate program is operated efficiently, fairly, and transparently. And the last element I want to talk about is the element involving outside money. 1773 includes a lengthy section defining precisely what is meant by coordination as it relates to a candidate's campaign and outside groups that are making independent expenditures in support of that campaign. It describes in detail the kinds of situations that are symptomatic of coordination, and it's interesting reading. Now you might question why this language is included in a bill about citizen-funded elections. Well, I asked that question. It didn't dawn on me right away, but it actually is quite straightforward. Systems of this kind, citizen-funded election systems, are often criticized as being defenseless in the face of a flood of outside money in elections. We can debate the merits of that argument, but there is no question that anything we can do to stem that flood would be helpful. And given the Supreme Court's current interpretation of the First Amendment, we can't ban outside spending, but we can articulate and enforce the rules laid out for it so that candidates don't use outside spending groups as a regulation-free arm of their campaigns. And speaking of outside money, 1773 also includes language empowering the CEB to recommend whether the civic dollar system should be expanded to congressional elections. And that, as we know, is where real money is. So I strongly encourage you to support HB 1773, and thank you for considering my testimony.
Thank you for your testimony. Questions from committee members? Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for taking my question, sir. You are talking about establishing a board that would have complete oversight over these CBEs. Who would choose that board, and who would be on that board?
It is set up, and I don't have the bill right in front of me, but I think the President of the Senate appoints one, and the minority leader in the Senate would appoint one in the same House, so there would be two from each of the parties, and then by consensus, those four decide who the fifth member should be.
Thank you. You cited grants as being one source of the fund. I'm not aware of any grants that we could apply for such a thing. Are you?
No, I was referring to other systems of publicly funded elections. Some, for instance, the main system involves grants from public funds to participating candidates. This one does not.
Yeah, grants had been mentioned a few times, so I was just trying to get clarification on that. Thank you very much.
Further questions, Representative Cody?
Thank you. I was just trying to get a sense of, is there a template on which this bill is based? Is there a state that's already doing this, or what's the...
There are 3 states currently with full-fledged systems. And so, yes, there is a template in terms of having a board and having mechanisms. Each one of them has its own idiosyncrasies. This is the only one that is looking at this civic dollar system, where voters actually have the opportunity to support candidates.
That actually is what prompted my question, because I don't know that I had seen that earlier.
Not in any state systems. So municipal systems, yes, not state systems.
Representative Sousa.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for taking my question. This bill talks about the mechanism of enforcement, and it would take away the power of the Attorney General to enforce these laws?
No, I think it's quite clear that the CEB would work in concert with the Attorney General, and I think in the fiscal note in the back there is mention from the Attorney General's office that they would be there as consultants, something like that.
Thank you.
Further questions, Representative Porter?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for that question. Does the Secretary of State's office have any involvement with this system that you're setting up?
I don't know the answer to that question, I'm sorry.
Further question, Representative Gay?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. What is the difference if we're trying to restrict the amount of money that's being spent? What is the difference between a complex system as this and simply limiting the legal amount people can give?
I think, well, and speakers to follow me will speak at this point as well, but I think it opens up the population of donors enormously. Right now, it's less than, I don't know, somebody has it, there's like 2% or less of eligible voters actually donate to campaigns in this state. This has the potential to get many, many more people involved in small donations.
Thank you. Representative Silver?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my questions. On these vouchers that you distribute to all the registered voters, would they have an expiration date? And you know, right now we know, for example, that people frequently get gift cards, and the the issuers of gift cards rely on the fact that a fairly large percentage of people that have gift cards just don't use them, and they expire, or they're not used. And so if a person is apathetic and they get these things in the mail and they just file it away or put it in the circular file or something like that, or is there going to be an expiration date on these vouchers?
My understanding is once the election's over, if you still have vouchers in hand, they're worth nothing.
Thank you.
Further questions, Representative Dean Bailey?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just another question on the vouchers. Do you know, would they be attributed to one person, or if someone's not going to use the vouchers, could they be someone who might want to use it, or?
No, they are non-transferable.
Further questions? If I might, Mr. Gordon, thank you for taking my question. Just for the board members, page 7 deals with the expiration in December of any certificates issued in the year of the election. Representative Cody asked about templates and where this came from. You mentioned that there were 3 states that had something of a similar system, but you're also telling us that this is the only one proposing civic dollars. So if you could clarify that for me, please?
Well, Maine, Arizona, and Connecticut all have public funding systems.
And further question, do you know whether that, when you say that, is that because those states have income taxes and you can designate a portion of your, do you know what the funding, I'm seeing a lot of no's behind you, so maybe somebody is going to speak to it after this.
No, I think, I know in Arizona, the money comes from speeding tickets.
So it comes from a general fund source raised some other way? Okay.
Yes.
And so where did the template for this civic dollar approach come from? Because this is, while I think our legislative aids are terrific, this is a pretty big bill, so my suspicion is it's come from somewhere else.
The idea has been around for a long time. There is a bill in Congress, a very good bill for public funding at the federal level, which includes a similar mechanism. And there are municipalities that are doing this. Seattle is an example, very successfully.
Thank you. Further, does anyone else have any further questions for the witness? I'm seeing up for the witness. I always say that, so thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Also signed up to speak for this bill is John Roth.
Members of the committee, John Rao. I was, a while ago, in 1992, the Democratic candidate for the United States Senate. I'm a former national board member of Common Cause. And I left the board of Common Cause when they put tremendous energy behind the McCain-Feingold bill, which accomplished some, but not enough. And I founded Americans for Campaign Reform here in New Hampshire with 4 former United States senators. On the Democratic side, Senators Bradley, Bill Bradley, and Bob Kerrey. And on the Republican side, Senator Al Simpson of Wyoming, and our dear and belated Senator Warren Redmond of New Hampshire. And you may wonder, why did Warren Redmond support this? And if Warren were sitting here today, I have absolutely no doubt that he would be exceedingly positive and encouraged to support this. And you may wonder why. Warren voted against this kind of bill, public funding, in 1992 in the United States Senate. And when we met with Warren in 2004, having founded Americans for Campaign Reform and wanting Warren to be the 4th co-chair, there was no reason more important in Warren's mind. And by the way, it took him at least 3 weeks of questioning and thinking before he called me and said, "We're ready to go." And there was no reason more important than Warren's sense that we were not attracting into the Congress many of the leaders with the qualities and characteristics that we needed. He was deeply disappointed in the Congress, and Warren, of course, has passed away 3 or 4 years ago. And he felt that with this bill, when we get rid of the money barrier, so that we can search for our leaders, anybody, the money would not be the barrier, that we have an opportunity, not a guarantee, to have a Congress that could meet our challenges. Now let me be clear. The benefits of public funding are huge. In my mind, they're transformational. And yes, to begin, getting rid of the impact of special interest money, public funding, if you're in the state senate or executive council or your governor, you don't need that special interest money because you would have the public funds and the money you raised under the limits that have been expressed. So you're minimizing to a dramatic extent the impact of special interest money power. Second, the voices of every American and every citizen in this state would count. Their perspectives would be heard. They wouldn't be second to those who have the money to buy influence. But for me, most important, far and away the most important, is the point I made about why Warren backed this. And that is that we get rid of the money barrier. So the pool of candidates from which we in this state can pick our leaders, and it would fly federally if passed, is expanded to all citizens. The pool today, you want to be governor? You want to run for governor? The pool today for those who are possible candidates for governor is tiny. Let's be specific. You have a famous name? I'm not here in any way to disparage our current governor. But clearly having a famous name helps. And by the way, I never would have been a serious candidate. I lost to Judd Gregg in 1992 by 2 percentage points. Never would have happened if I hadn't made some money in business. Is that a criteria for serving in high office? I suggest it's not. So look at the pool, look at our current, our recent candidates for governor. One had a famous name, several, Governors Benson and Lynch, happened to have wealth, as I did when I ran. Governor Shaheen happened to do good work with President Carter in the primary and had national contacts to raise the money. The pool today is limited to those with a famous name, with wealth, or the contacts to raise the money. That is ridiculous as a way of searching for the finest that we can have in our leadership positions. I believe that for New Hampshire to adopt this, we will have a far better opportunity. And I'm not being critical of any of our leaders, that's not my point. But going forward with the role that money plays under the current private financing system, with a public funding system, I believe we will have a far better opportunity to elect leaders who can meet our challenges and who can capitalize on our opportunities and can reinforce our values. It so happens that should New Hampshire pass this, there is the potential to have an impact on federal public funding initiatives. We would be, as Rick said, the fourth state. We now had first Maine, then Arizona, and now Connecticut. We would be the fourth state, and we're a purple state. So I think the fact that we have accomplished this and said we want public funding for our New Hampshire elections would have some, let me not overstate, some impact on the federal initiative. And we happen to have the first in the nation primary. And at this stage, you all pass this, and we go into the presidential primary, and we point out to the candidates for president and say, hey, you want to do well in New Hampshire? People in New Hampshire want this. Our legislature represents the people. They have voted for public funding. We suggest if you want to do well in the New Hampshire primary, you come out for public funding also. In closing, I believe long-term, not short-term, long-term, the most important issue facing our state, and yes, federally, is public funding of elections. Why? Because everything else follows from who gets elected. And this, I believe, is fundamental to long-term the state and ultimately the nation, electing those who can meet our challenges, uphold our values, capitalize on our opportunities. So thank you so very much.
Do board members have questions? Representative Day.
When you're trying to, if this passes, and when you're trying to put it into effect, how do you stop all the millions coming into the state?
A very important question, and you don't. There is, under our First Amendment, as I'm sure you're all aware, no way to restrict a citizen from using his or her net worth independently and not coordinated to help or hurt a candidate. Yes, Citizens United did allow for the creation of super PACs, which are really corporations, and therefore independent money flowing into them increased because it was an easy vehicle, a super PAC. But to answer your question, we're not going to stop significant independent expenditures, even if Citizens United happen to be term. And therefore, it goes to a discussion you had with Rick Gordon, some of you did a minute ago. and that is, ooh, look at all this money. Will this system provide enough? To be clear, any public funding bill does not allow a quality candidate who works hard to raise enough money to put on a competitive campaign fails. And I can assure you that the work done on this campaign supports them. In other words, we believe that candidates for governor, executive council, and senate, good candidates, whatever their political perspectives, who work hard, will raise sufficient funds to be competitive in that particular election. And as we know from years of research, you can't buy an election.
Thank you. Representative Sousa.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Attorney Rath, for taking my question. What protection would there be for citizens who did not want to use these? For instance, if a group they belonged to wanted everybody in their group to collect all the vouchers and send them to a particular candidate, they'd be under more pressure than if they were just being asked to contribute. Knowing these vouchers out there and everybody has them, wouldn't the public be a little bit vulnerable to pressure to have them all collected by certain groups and sent in?
Certain organizations may bring citizens together and pull the vouchers and send them on.
Well, I think if we could rephrase the question, because there are lots of scenarios one could come up with in regards to the holding of any sort of certificate issued. So what is to prevent the use of a certificate other than the qualified individual that it was issued to?
It's strictly limited to the use by that particular citizen. And the law, if a citizen hands it to another citizen, that's against the law, and that's why we need to bring in the AG.
And I'm saying this just so in the hopes we have a number of speakers, somebody can address it. It's my understanding from looking at this bill, then the expectation is this Clean Elections Board is going to somehow be setting up the process for that to occur, because I do not see that within the terms of this bill. And so I'm just putting that out there, so if that's incorrect, someone can address it at the testimony.
There is one, if I could, for just one question. And that goes to my point, you can't buy an election. If you could buy an election, Hillary Clinton was president of the United States. You cannot buy an election, but you have to have enough. Let's be realistic, and you bring out the independent super PAC money, so enough today is higher than it was 3 or 4 years ago. You can't buy it, but you darn well better have enough, and this bill would provide a quality candidate who worked hard.
Thank you. A further question, perhaps for you or someone else speaking. I note that this bill is effective upon passage, but the only date I have found in it, and I could miss it completely, talks about securing a system for the use of these vouchers by 2020. So on page 7. So if you know or someone else knows, someone else might be able to address the reality of implementation in the bill, given that many of the rules would be set up by this new board, that would be terrific. It's great what head nods and shakes can do when you have a seat. Further questions from board members? I'm seeing none. Thank you very much.
And thank you for your consideration.
Hearing from Open Democracy. And there has been written testimony passed out, and I'm passing this down to my right at this time. Trying to keep the extras up here. Thank you, Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wonder, is this machine taking my blood pressure?
You know, thank you for pointing that out to me. Whose machine is it up here? Is that yours, Daryl?
Yes.
I think I need an announcement. I understand you can record public meetings, but I'm going to have to, just so you know, I don't recall seeing that before. Have you brought that before?
Yes.
Okay. And put it on the table? Have I missed it completely? Okay. No. My clerk says he's seen it. I'm going to check, because I'm noticing it's taking up a lot of space, and I thought for some reason it was at other tables, but that's who's, we can record, and Liberty Lobby is recorded. So you're on tape, and you're on video, and we're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the committee. It is clear to the great majority of Americans, including Granite Staters, and especially those of us in the campaign finance reform arena, that there is too much money in politics, and that the result is an ever-growing reliance on and loyalty to the donor class. Indeed, as Americans, we do not have to connect the dots in that regard, because members of Congress recently were blatantly honest in their public remarks about their duty to pass legislation in order to appease their donors, prevent retaliation, and to improve their prospects for future campaign financing. This big money corruption of our elections system, one, has minimized the voice of ordinary citizens. A court ruling from 41 years ago equated money with speech. Translated, that means that those with limited financial means have limited speech. I believe that limitation includes everyone in this room. It has created very unfavorable conditions for candidates of ordinary means to run for office. In fact, aspiring to elected office is becoming more and more restricted to those with money or connected to those who have it or can raise it, and with it comes the requisite quid pro quo. It has resulted in gridlock as elected officials must pander to their donors. The UNH Survey Center included a question in its fall 2016 Granite State poll designed to gauge residents' opinions on a proposed campaign finance law. In that survey, 67% of residents favored a proposed new law to help reduce the influence of big money in elections, that being 46% strongly in favor, 21% somewhat. Only 7% opposed such a law. Quoting from a PPP survey conducted just last month, quote, "A new public policy polling survey finds that overwhelming bipartisan majorities believe big money in New Hampshire elections is a problem and support civic dollars to fix this issue. 80% of voters, including 79% of Democrats, 74% of Republicans, and 85% of independents, believe big money in New Hampshire elections is a problem. A bipartisan majority, 63%, including 70% of Democrats, 50% of Republicans, and 68% of independents, also supports a proposal to give each registered voter 4 $25 certificates or civic dollars to donate to political candidates who refuse to accept money from large donors and out-of-state donors. Majorities of Democrats, 71%, Republicans, 59%, and independents, 66%, would be more likely to support a candidate who funds his or her campaign with civic dollars than a candidate who funds his or her campaign with large and out-of-state donations," end quote. This bill would elevate the political voices of voters by providing them with the means to participate easily, directly, and meaningfully in our elections. I believe that with a civic dollar in hand, voters will be more inclined to do the necessary research to vet the array of candidates before them in order to assign their dollars appropriately. This bill is a hybrid of refining current law with a new section that administers the civic dollar component. It is an opportunity for this legislature to empower citizen involvement. I urge all in this room to take the time to refine this bill as needed and consistent with the wishes of New Hampshire residents to create a system that reduces the influence of large and out-of-state campaign contributions, passed it favorably out of committee. I would like to add just a bit to what I've heard this morning. I knew that, I think it may be coming up on 3 years ago, a Princeton study indicated that we do not have a democracy in this country. We have an oligarchy. that is ruled by the wealthy. So I heard for the first time this morning that another analyzing organization has concluded that we just have a flawed democracy. But whichever way it is, I hope that worries everyone in this room.
Thank you, Mr. Perry.
Thank you.
Former representative. Further questions from committee members? I'm seeing none. Thank you.
Thank you.
Also signed up for 1773 is Daryl.
No relation that I'm aware of. Thank you. For the record, Daryl Perry, CEO of Liberty Lobby LLC. The prime sponsor of this bill said that 1773 would create a level playing field for candidates. But looking through the bill and hearing testimony, I don't see how it creates a level playing field, because candidates for governor, executive council, and state senate would still need to contact people and ask them for these vouchers. So it doesn't create a level playing field there, because candidates with more name recognition would wind up getting more vouchers. There's the provision on page 11 that requires all participating candidates in contested elections to participate in at least one primary election debate and one general election debate. But it says nothing about whether or not such debates would include candidates that opt out of this provision. It also says nothing, and going back to the level playing field, says nothing about all candidates in the debate getting a stylist before the debate, getting a speech coach so that they can present themselves as best as possible to look as good as their competition. Or maybe they want to look better. There was the statement about in Arizona, where they do have something that they call the Clean Election Fund, that it's paid for by speeding tickets. It's not just speeding tickets. They also use civil asset forfeiture to fund that clean election. And I'm sure all of you here on the committee are aware of how horrible civil asset forfeiture is, because it does not require a criminal conviction, just the allegation that something was connected to illegal activity. And I have a question here on page 5, that the money for this Clean Election Fund would come from voluntary donations. Who is going out and soliciting these voluntary donations? And if people think that this is such a good idea to get voluntary donations that can then be distributed to candidates, why don't they just create a super PAC that they seem to not like? It seems as though they want the state of New Hampshire to be the super PAC. And also, if this is such a wonderful idea, and I disagree that it is, why does it not also apply to State House? Why is it only Governor, Executive Council, and State Senate? It also doesn't apply to County Office. So it seems as though the supporters are wanting to say it's a good idea, but only for select candidates. There's a lot more that I could say on this, but for the sake of time, I will not, and I will answer, or attempt to answer, any questions.
Questions from committee members for Representative Silver.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Perry. Would you agree that the First Amendment of the Constitution regarding freedom of speech also includes the freedom not to speak?
Yes.
Thank you.
Further questions from committee members after that, if you dare.
And a further note on that, if I may, if this does pass and I'm sent for vouchers, I would either send them through a shredder or light them on fire.
Any further questions? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Perry. To speak on 1773 is Liz Ibecki.
And I'm actually speaking on behalf of Jim Rubens. I do have copies of his
Oh,
testimony.
I'm sorry, you did put that on the card, thank you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chairperson Griffin and members of the committee. It's from Jim Rubens of New Hampshire. Please consider this letter my testimony in support of HB 1773 establishing a fund to provide campaign financing for eligible candidates for governor, councilor, and state senator. I am out of state for this hearing date, otherwise I would testify in person. My lengthy and varied experience in New Hampshire election campaigns has convinced me of the need for a public election financing system as a voluntary alternative for candidates. I have served in the past as a Republican state senator, chair of the GOP Platform Committee, chair of the year 2000 GOP Redistricting Committee, spokesman, senior policy advisor for candidate for governor Gordon Humphrey, and myself candidate for governor and U.S. senator. I have also served on 2 election finance panels which have proposed public election financing legislation. In my U.S. Senate campaigns, I proposed voter tax rebates as a means to provide public finance mechanisms for congressional elections. The present purely private elections finance system seriously restricts participation by otherwise viable candidates for governor, councilor, state senate, and narrows the range of debate and policy proposals during campaigns. The result is fewer choices for voters among candidates and slower progress in solving public policy challenges. Additionally, the current purely private system tilts influence away from voters and toward those with money to spend on campaigns. As to HB 1773, I recognize the historic difficulty in budgeting general fund monies for public elections financing. In the absence of a complete cost projection in the fiscal note accompanying this bill, I encourage the committee to consult widely to complete this task. So should this committee not see fit to recommend OTP as a result of general fund budget concerns, I strongly urge members to craft an alternately funded version of this bill for recommended passage. I and other public elections finance supporters are ready to help with specific ideas. Thank you for your service and for your consideration of these thoughts. Jim Ribbons.
Thank you. Before I ask the committee, I'm going to ask you whether you would take questions or not.
I can try.
All right, thank you. When you get sent as an emissary, I'm not sure it's fair. Are there any committee members who have questions? I'm seeing none. Thank you very much. Speak on HB 1773 is Dan Weeks from New Hampshire Rebellion.
Good morning, or good afternoon now. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Dan Weeks. I served until recently as chair of the Board of Open Democracy, a volunteer position, and I'm pleased to be here during part of my work day to address what I believe is a very important issue. I promised I would have had written testimony, but my one-year-old boy decided this morning that he was done sleeping, so the time allocated for that was no longer available, but I appreciate the chance to speak, and I'll leave you with testimony from 2 other volunteer members of the organization who wish they could be here today. This is, as I think you all know, a very substantial proposal. It's a groundbreaking idea for the state of New Hampshire, and I want to say at the outset, thank you very much for taking time to dig into this. And I know that it will take more time, and I want to be here as a concerned citizen, and I think many others in this room, to be a resource and help you work through this complicated proposal. I want to also say at the outset, I believe each year as our elected officials, you see literally thousands of proposals addressing a dizzying array of individual substantive issues. I believe this is of a different kind from all of those. What we are asking you to think about here is changing the fundamentals of the political system within which we address all of those individual issues. This is not the same kind. This is looking at the very foundations of our democracy and asking the question, who has a major voice today, who has a seat at the table, and who does not? And can we come up with a more fair, equitable distribution? I want to just share at the beginning 3 reasons why I believe this is a vitally important proposal, HB 1773 for New Hampshire, and then a little bit of a personal perspective. First of all, as has been referenced here already this morning, we've seen the cost of campaigns rise to obscene levels, where 30 years ago in 1986, former Senator, late Senator Warren Rudman, who has been mentioned, ran against Governor Endicott Peabody. The total race cost in today's dollars $1.5 million. 30 years later, 2016, that same U.S. Senate race cost $150 million. A 100-fold increase, already adjusted for inflation, which contributes in part to what I would say is the second reason: who pays for this system. You've seen the polls, some of them have been cited this morning. 80%, by some measures 90% of citizens do not have faith in our government, believing, absolutely convinced that, particularly in Washington, but even in state government, that our elected officials do not directly represent the people, are not beholden primarily to the people in spite of their best intentions. And I've gotten to know many elected representatives, and I do believe that is absolutely your intention, but the public perception is very real, and it is insidious, I would say, to our democracy. And my third brief reason is, if we look at who gives today, who funds our campaigns today. A couple of years ago, Open Democracy came out with months of research on something called the Open Democracy Index. That showed that 591 granite staters, that's 0.05%. 591 granite staters give a majority of all the money that funds campaigns in this state. Only 1% of granite staters give any money at all. Most of those people, like me, giving the occasional $25 check. Only 591 gave more than half. And most of those donors, $1,000, $2,000, $7,000 donors, were giving on behalf of organized lobbies, as lobbyists themselves or on behalf of those interest groups. That is not a system that I think could be called a democracy, and which is why, again, I would suggest that this issue is a bit different from the individual substantive issues that you hear from by the thousands each cycle. This looks at the very system within which we try to address those issues and move forward as a state. A brief personal note on why this is so important to me. As some of you know, about 2 years ago at this time, I was contemplating a run for office myself for Executive Council in District 5. As I was talking to political professionals who I knew would be an important part of a viable campaign, what I heard from the pros was pretty simple, really. Do you have $1 million of your own so that you could make six-figure contributions to your campaign to assure that you would be credible? The answer to that was a quick no. Do you have a network of people who are worth millions of dollars? And can you come up with a list of dozens or preferably a few hundred individuals who you know can and would consider writing checks of $1,000, $2,000, even $7,000, which, thanks to an existing loophole, is as much as I could have accepted as a candidate. I was very blessed that I got to go to some elite universities, and I did know some people who could write $1,000, $2,000 checks, the most that I accepted. And because of that, and the third question, are you willing to spend hours every day on the phone asking for money? Because I could answer at least two of those questions with a yes, they said, go for it, you'll be a serious candidate. And I did. I spent countless hours sitting at the back of a pretty dumpy office in Nashua as I was running for Executive Council, asking people, a lot of them, frankly, out of state. They weren't trying to buy influence because they happened to be personal friends of mine who thought I was a good enough guy to merit some support. But I was also told that I needed to call all the unions. I ran as a Democrat. I needed to call all the trial lawyers and other interest groups, the people with a history of giving, because that's how you are serious. I think I'm an okay guy. But I do not think those should be the criteria on the basis of which somebody can be a serious candidate for something like Executive Council. And then think about governor, where the cost isn't six figures, but easily seven figures. Or U.S. Senate or Congress, etc. So, for me, back to my one-year-old boy this morning who kept me up, I am deeply concerned that our ability as a state to meet the big challenges we face is deeply compromised by this abject lack of public faith in the system, by the perception and sometimes the reality that politics isn't open to ordinary people. Thank God for the House, for your service. I know you don't do it for the money, and many of you spend very little on your campaigns, and I admire that. But we do know, and to the prior question, why this focuses on the Senate, Executive Council, and Governor, those are routinely six-figure and seven-figure campaigns, and no ordinary citizen can run for those offices, and it shouldn't be that way. By going from a system of small money from a few, 591 people, to, big money from a few, to a system of small money from many, $25, 4 of these $25 certificates from ordinary citizens, we suddenly put political purchasing power, we put voice in the hands of every eligible voter in our state. A lot of them wouldn't use them. Some would light them on fire. That's perfectly fine with me. But citizens could choose in a way they can't today, unless they're very wealthy to begin with and well-connected. They could choose to have a meaningful role to play in this process. And candidates would have a powerful incentive to say no to the private money system. They've got to strike a deal here. They say no big money, no contributions over $250, in exchange for which I will go to my citizens, to the people I actually want to elect. No out-of-state donors can give this money. And I will run on the basis of their support. Let me close. I too had the privilege of working for several years with the late Senator Warren Rudman. As you know, I ran as a Democrat. I happen to be from an old Republican family and was privileged to work with a former Republican senator. There are a lot of issues that divide this House and our state. I believe this is not one of those. That when we're talking about a democratic republic actually being responsible to the people, you just can't have a system where private money from a few puts our politicians in power and call it representative of the people. I don't care if those are conservatives or liberals. And you look at Maine, Arizona, Connecticut, there are far-right conservatives running with the system and far-left Democrats. And they're succeeding, all of them, if they appeal to the people and have the people's support. So I thank you very much for your consideration of this challenging proposal. I'd be happy to take any questions you have.
Questions from committee members, Representative Porter.
No, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question, Ms. Weeks. I think our chair asked before, and I just out of curiosity, who sat down and worked up this proposal that you presented to us? Who were those people?
Thank you for asking. I'm proud to say that I was one of the main people. I have, as a high school student at Conval, I became very passionate about this issue. I got to know Warren Rudman and Granny D and have worked on it for close to 20 years now. And so over those years, I have put a lot of time into drafting these proposals, including this one. Part of the basis was a commission established in 2008, on which Brad Cook served. I was an advisor to that committee in a volunteer capacity, as were other people in this room and elsewhere. They developed this. The model we draw in part from the model of Maine, Arizona, and Connecticut, and more recently Seattle. And there are a couple of nonprofit organizations that support this work in various states. And so we've gone to all comers for input. But I can say that this particular concept, one thing we wanted to do was move away from prior models where it's kind of a one-size-fits-all, every candidate gets the same lump sum. No, we think actually going out and appealing to ordinary citizens for small donations is a good thing in a democracy. We don't think giving money is the problem, we think big money from a few is the problem. And so we want to make this, in the spirit of New Hampshire participation, one where candidates aren't getting grants, lump sums from some government fund, they're actually getting it directly from citizens. So that's a unique innovation that we brought here.
Further question?
The commission that you mentioned in 2008, was that legislatively set up, or was that instituted by the governor or whatever?
It was legislatively established, yes.
And they came out with a report?
They came out with a report. It was chaired by Attorney Brad Cook. And that report is available, and we'd be happy to circulate it.
That would probably be helpful. Representative Pearson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Lucas. I'm sure it's been a busy day already. Sounds like it has. I just let me start off by saying I'm totally behind things like this, and on a more fundamental level. I'm here because of campaign finance reform. I got interested in college, maybe a little after high school, my high school days, but still, that's the reason I'm here. That said, from what I've seen on these implementations in Maine and otherwhere, it is not so much the participation of citizens, but the participation of the candidates themselves. It doesn't matter whether or not I would agree to do this because it doesn't apply to state reps, but have you or anyone else, I guess, who will be testifying in the future, have you at all reached out to any of the upcoming candidates for governor, state senate, executive council, and asked if they would agree to do something like this?
That's a great question. I am not aware of specific conversations with current or likely candidates in New Hampshire. I do know that we heard testimony from a former state senator, Jim Rubens. We have talked to and we have sponsors in the Senate, so I'm presuming that by sponsoring this bill, they would intend to participate in it. And I would note that in the states of Maine, Arizona, Connecticut, we see large majorities of candidates voluntarily opting into the system, even though in some cases they have the money to fund their own campaign, or they could raise it because their network. The voters demand this of them. They want to own the candidates as opposed to having, some lobbyists or some other special interests owning them. So although it's voluntary, participation is high.
Representative Harrington.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. I'm just trying to get a handle on how this will work. Forget about philosophy for a second. It appears that you're talking about your 591 really rich people out there. They're still going to be there. And they're still going to want to give money to campaigns to try to buy influence, or at least get someone who they think will do the job that they want done elected. So they're going to give money to someone who doesn't go along with this program, so there's no cap on them. And then there's going to be somebody else that comes up, and they're going to hope to rely on these $425 certificates from various people. But the person who's got the large money behind them to begin with, and the large donations, they're the ones that are going to be taking out the TV ads and the radio ads and newspaper ads. So people are going to hear, vote for Charlie, don't vote for Sally, because Charlie's so good. So people with this $25, I think there's as much chance as someone would just say, they just wouldn't use them because they figure they're hearing one side of it anyway. So it seems to me you're going to go with this type of thing where anybody can opt out. And I think we've had some limits before where both candidates have decided not to go with the limit because they could get so much money. I don't see how they're not going to, just for the most part, especially in the big races, that the Senate race that you mentioned, I mean, when there's $120 million on the table, someone's going to look at this and just say, no, I'm never going to consider that because, I need tens of millions of dollars. And if everybody that got their $4 $25 certificates gave it to one candidate, it wouldn't be anywhere near enough money.
Yeah, thank you, Representative, for the question. This is a key point, and I hope I can address it well. Also related to Representative Gay's question about why not just put a mandatory limit on the size of donations. If we were like virtually every other advanced democracy in the world, the answer would simply be private money does not have an inherent right to fund public campaigns. It is either severely limited or proscribed from politics, and public funding alone will fund races. That is how virtually every other democracy in the world funds its elections. We don't need to be like others, but there may be some lesson there. Because of existing Supreme Court jurisprudence, the Buckley v. Vallejo decision, it is not permissible under their interpretation of the First Amendment to restrict the amount that a candidate can spend on election. There are limits on the size of donations. Thus, this creative voluntary solution, which the courts have upheld because it's voluntary. The trick to make it actually work is that the incentive, the benefit to participate for candidates is real. For me, if I rewind 2 years, if I was making that decision whether to run and how then to fund my campaign, and I could choose as a candidate to either spend those countless hours in that back of my dumpy office on the phone to people I didn't really care to talk about, asking for money in a race that they're not that interested in if they're my college buddy. Or I could rather spend those hours out in all 33 towns in District 5, knocking on real voters' doors, asking if they would hear me out, give me their ideas, and if they seem amenable to what I have to offer, assign their $25 certificate to me. I'd choose the second one hands down. Not just because I'm going to get some money to put in my coffer as a candidate, but because it's one and the same with actual campaigning, retail campaigning, New Hampshire style. That's a good thing. The other reason that this works when we do the math, and we'd be happy to share with you simulations we've run looking at past contribution levels and assuming candidates opted in, would they have enough money to be viable, a point that John Rao made that's so important. We find that because this is now open to every eligible voter in the state, close to 1 million people, that the pool of potential donors to whom candidates can appeal is so large that a candidate who opts out of the big money system and goes with the civic dollars instead has a real chance of raising enough money. They may not have the most, they can't write themselves $1 million check if they've got the money in the bank, but they'll have enough to be viable. And if you do some math, $25 donations, if you get 1,000 of those, $25,000, that's a pretty good start for a young candidate, maybe a first-time candidate running for state senate. If you multiply that by 4, $100,000, that's a competitive threshold to run for senate. You got to do a lot of work to get 4,000 of those donations, but the pool of donors is no longer the 1% who give today or the 0.05% who give meaningfully today. It's everybody. So when we do that math, run those simulations, we are confident that candidates would see the benefit of participating and would do so in large numbers.
Follow-up?
Follow-up,
Do
please.
you have any numbers? I mean, let's just say there's one candidate is a race for governor or whatever. One candidate opts out, one candidate opts in.
Mm-hmm.
What are you projecting that the candidate who opts into the program, I mean, you're not going to get 100% of those donations because a lot of people are going to say, well, he's a Democrat, he's a Republican, so I'm not giving him money. So what's the maximum you could hope for, 50, 55%?
So we run all of these simulations, and I'd be glad to sit down or someone from Open Democracy to walk through our assumptions and our specific estimates. But you can take those who gave before and assign them each a $25 limit, then the amount would be quite a bit below current funding levels. Or you can assume that more people would participate because they all have these certificates available, and then you are at parity. Based on our conservative assumptions about participation levels, the total amount funding candidates would be on par or slightly above the current levels, suggesting to them that it's viable. Another important question is, what would this cost if the state, if you as the House and the Senate decided to pass and fund this? And there are a variety of ideas we have for funding it. Our conservative estimates are $4 or $5 million a year, assuming a high level of citizen participation and assuming candidates are getting enough money through this system to be viable. Again, those are early estimates. You would have the option of saying not more than a certain amount would be spent, and if we hit that cap, then maybe candidates can no longer receive civic dollars, but instead they can maybe raise private donations. There's some mechanisms there. But if you take, say, $5 million a year out of a roughly $5 billion a year budget, that's 1/10 of 1% of our state budget. And something which I, as a citizen, would willingly pay $5 toward, because I believe it would give me a much stronger democracy.
Further questions, Representative Stewart?
The civic dollars, certificates, each worth $25. There is also in the bill, as I recall, I don't know what the numbers contribution limits that individuals can make that I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, are funds that can be raised in addition to receiving the civic dollar. So, the question is, as a practical matter, we have to determine that we're going to be issuing an awful lot of civic dollars, so we are going to at some point need to know exactly how much money is involved. And it sounds to me like a finite number. Can you determine from, is multiplying the total number of registered voters by $100, is that an accurate way of describing how much it's going to cost to fund the first half of the program? The second half is going to be in private contributions themselves. That's exactly the way it works.
So this is something, I said at the beginning, this is a challenging bill. This is something which we would urge you as a committee and the full House and the Senate to grapple with. We gladly share our ideas. If you said there was no cap, there would be the possibility of this system costing the state a lot of money. If every eligible voter, close to 1 million people over the age of 18 in New Hampshire, decided that they were going to use these civic dollars, that would cost the public, or whatever the funding mechanism is, a great deal of money.
100 million. Right,
To be
pretty
precise.
Okay, so let's get to the, all right, thank you. All right.
And that is far more money than we need.
I don't, and I
to-
apologize, I don't mean to be rude, I just thought the math was pretty easy, and thank you for having done that.
Indeed, thank you, Madam Chair. One option, which I would encourage you to consider, is that you say, at least the public portion of this fund, if you were to assign a funding mechanism, cap it at a reasonable level, at a level that we know will create a generally competitive campaign environment. And then if candidates, they are not under any limit on the number of donations up to $250 each that they can raise. So if they run out of money under this system, they can continue to raise private donations. And to be frank, if somebody gives you, assigns 25 of their civic dollars, they're much more likely to add on another 25 of their own dollars on top of that, maybe a couple of times. So the net effect is a flowering of more civic participation in elections.
Thank you, Representative Sousa.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the question. But if you think you're gonna need 100 million, and you print 4 vouchers per voter, but it's capped at 3 or 4 million, whose vouchers get used?
In that case, I presume it would be on a first-come, first-served basis. So candidates would have an incentive to get out, pounding the pavement, soliciting these vouchers. I think in reality, when we look today at the fact that not more than 1% of Granite Staters give any money at all, 1% of 100 million is 1 million, I think that would be lower than a competitive total sum funding our state, Senate, Executive Council, and gubernatorial elections. So we'd want to be maybe in the 10% range. But because you're starting at such a low baseline, it seems absolutely implausible to me that we would be topping 30%. I think we would more likely be in the 5 to 10%, and that might gradually increase. If the legislature decided in future years that there was a lot of participation, but we didn't want so much additional money in, perhaps the value of each would come down from 25 to 20. These are all hypothetical ideas, but my point is that the value of going from a system where literally this tiny fraction of 1% funds our campaigns to one that is open to all citizens and that has a reasonable chance of engaging thousands upon thousands of citizens who feel they have no voice today, I don't think that can be underestimated.
Thank you. Further questions from the committee? I'm seeing none. Thank you very
Thank you so much for your time, and I'll send around these written testimonies from other citizen supporters who couldn't be here today.
Okay, why don't, if you could give them to me, so I've got them for the record. Did somebody sign in for these people on the blue sheet or not? No. So if you...
We will do so.
Just,
Thank
yeah,
you.
if you could put their name down. This is testimony from Deborah Summer in support, and testimony from Karina Dodge in support. Thank you. I also have John Raby from New London, New Hampshire.
That's correct. Welcome. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time. Friendly warning as I start out. Among the people testifying today, I probably qualify as the resident cynic and the resident dreamer. A number of wise questions regarding practicalities have come up surrounding this bill. One thing that concerns me, though, is that amongst all these practicalities that have their place, we're going to lose sight of some basic principles. And as far as practicalities are concerned, Dan Weeks has done a far better presentation than I have. I heard of this bill a few days ago by email, and when I learned about it, I felt obliged to come down here because I said, at last, we have another attempt, another worthwhile attempt to do something about what the Supreme Court did in Buckley Citizens United, and McCutcheon. But before I get to that, I want to address a point that John Rao made about buying elections. Now, as I see it, there are a number of turning points in any election campaign. It could be a slip of the tongue, an interview, a press release, a debate, but for me, the two most important are who gets to win and who gets to run. Now, today, we have heard testimony to the effect that money determines who gets to run. Now, as I see that, what that means is that you can buy elections any year you want. That's the first point I want to make. Second, I think the most important question facing us in this room is how much free speech is worth. Now, my argument revolves primarily around that principle rather than campaign finance reform. As I see it, even though the Supreme Court was convinced that it was defending free speech in those rulings, what the court actually did was to set up a system of censorship driven by money. As I see it, this is extremely dangerous. People have already pointed out in this room how flawed our democracy actually is. So this bill, as I see it, is an attempt at an antidote. You see, as I see it, what the court did was to take a sacred principle, a civil right that should be freely and equally available to everyone, and turn it into merchandise available only to those who have the deepest pockets. And I say it again, that does not defend free speech, that undermines it. So I am for any proposed antidote that will restore free speech to its full vigor. And I see this bill as one such potential antidote. I've heard questions about funding. Again, I repeat, how much is free speech worth to us? If it is vitally important, if it is essential to this country as a democracy, we'll find the money. Will I pony up the taxes to pay for such a system? You bet. I'll answer any questions as best I can.
Thank you. Questions from committee members? I'm seeing none. Thank you very much
Thank you.
for speaking in support of the bill. The last speaker I have signed up for this bill, so if there's anybody else who wishes to speak to this bill, please have a pink card passed up to me, is Joe Magruder from Open Democracy. And if somebody could pass up the blue sheet, which I understand has a number, might be multiple sheets, that would be great. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee, and thank you for delving so deeply into this bill. My name is Joe Magruder. I'm a retired editor and reporter, was for 30 years in this state, so I've seen a little politics. I'm active in Open Democracy, also the Kent Street Coalition here in Concord. I came to talk about the costs of not passing this bill, not having public funding. And as somebody else mentioned, finding data, nitty-gritty data on state level stuff is much more difficult, is difficult in New Hampshire, election spending and so forth. It's much easier at the federal level. The costs of having basically government greatly influenced by big money are pretty obvious on the federal level. Two glaring examples are Now and again, Congress gives the Pentagon weapons or weapons systems that it didn't ask for and doesn't want. Also, the fact that Medicare is barred from negotiating prescription drug prices with pharmaceutical companies. I think there's a lot of support that that's a bad idea. State level, I would, two things that I would mention that are current is since we're always in a money squeeze in this state, maybe we were too generous with the business tax cuts if we needed them at all. I had the school voucher bill, the school scholarship program. There we are. Our schools need money, and we have, over a period of at least a couple of decades now, we've been downsizing what formerly were costs borne by the state, for example, school building aid, and we've pushed them off onto counties, towns, and cities and their property taxpayers. If we had Democratic governor and legislature, I would be somebody could be a conservative and cite other things on the other side. Other costs, I think it's been pretty well covered. Our democracy, as I see it, and a lot of us see it, is broken, and a major reason is money in politics. So I'm not going to read what I wrote here. I will observe that the electorate, especially with respect to Congress, tends to be much more centrist and willing to compromise and tolerant of the other side than the composition of Congress. And I think in the states with public funding of elections, there has been, I don't know if it's measurable, but there is the belief that it has toned down politics and tended to pull people more to the center. Loss of trust in government got covered pretty well by other people, certainly limiting the pool of candidates for who can actually run, especially for governor, has been covered pretty well. So I am bouncing around trying to corporations that much consideration. And Beth Edmonds, a Democrat, former state Senate president in Maine. When I'm walking the halls of the legislature and I see lobbyists for major corporations or even small organizations, I know that I get to make decisions that think about all the people in my constituencies, all the people in my district, and not just specific interest groups. And there's plenty more of that. Another point, I don't know if Boss Tweed has been brought up at this hearing. I'll bring him up very briefly then. The notorious Tammany Hall boss in New York. He had a saying, I don't care who gets to do the electing as long as I get to do the nominating. And what we have, because of the power of donors and the need to raise enormous amounts of money, especially for government or Congress, but still a factor, executive council and state senate, what we have is a money primary. Invisible goes on around 365 days a year. You've got to be out asking people for money the whole time, and if you can't do it or don't have the stomach to do it, then you aren't really in the game. Another point, just listening to questions and testimony that I wanted to raise, I don't know if somebody said it before, Professor Larry Lessig, who is sort of the intellectual godfather of the New Hampshire Rebellion, makes the point, as do others, that our system of financing campaigns, funding campaigns, is corrupt, and the point was made about this 2014 study, Princeton, Gillens and Page, business interests and the wealthy have significant effect on policy decisions by Congress, where there's measurable public polling to know what the public wants, and ordinary citizens, their influence is near zero, statistically insignificant. So we do have a broken, I say corrupt, campaign finance system. That absolutely does not mean, and by and large is not the case, that elected officials, certainly including New Hampshire legislators working for $100 a session, are not personally corrupt. And the same is true of most members of Congress. It is the system, the constant pressure, the need to raise money. In Lessig's book, he quotes some, I think it was a candidate or a newly elected U.S. representative, saying that, you know, what she learned early after she won was you've got to learn to lean to the green, meaning where your donations come from, who's holding fundraisers for you. So it has its effect without needing people, the actual officials, to be personally corrupt. There are a few of those. Two more points. I've been part of the New Hampshire Rebellion since it started in late 2013. I'm a rookie compared to John Rao or Dan Weeks, but I've read a lot and studied a lot, and public funding of elections, there is no silver bullet for the problem of money in politics. Probably as close as we come right now is public funding of elections. It does a world of good. People have kept mentioning Maine, Arizona, and Connecticut. Those are statewide systems with broad coverage. If you go to the National Conference of State Legislators website and add in the public funding, you will find a great map and list. Public funding is actually happening all over the place on a smaller scale. It's happening, democracy dollars in Seattle, I think a county in New York just did it. There is a county in Maryland that just did it, and there are many other municipalities. They have a map that is quite, actually 2014, I believe. I haven't seen an updated version, but it's quite striking, and a list. Judicial elections is another place where there are public funding systems. My last point, and I don't know if this has been made, often this public funding or reforming public funding is seen as a partisan issue or something that mainly liberals and progressives support, and numerically there's some truth to that, but there have been some some conservatives who have been staunch sounders of the alarm and supporters of cleaning up this problem. One of them was Barry Goldwater, of course, the 1964 Republican presidential nominee, and I would say fairly conservative icon. Somebody mentioned the 1976 Buckley v. Vallejo decision, which was bad for those of us who want money out of politics. Goldwater opposed it, called for overturning it, and he is quoted in Richard Painter's book, Taxation Only with Representation. I'm going to read 2 sentences. Candidates must be more than caricatures who front for donors with the most money. They should not be paid hands of any vested interest group, nor appear to be so. Pretty strong language. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
Try.
Questions from committee members to the speaker? I'm seeing none. Thank you.
Thank you.
Also, since I have received a pink card to speak in support of 1773 from John Window.
Thank you.
Go ahead, thank you.
Thank you. I wasn't planning to speak here at all, and especially not on the topic that I'm going to voice to you, because it's something nobody here wants to hear. Nobody will want to hear what I am about to say. So I'm going to preface it with a few remarks about who I am, just so that you know that it's not coming from somebody who knows nothing about what he's going to say. I have a PhD in physics from Cambridge University, England. I was a student of 2 Nobel Prize winners, Professor Martin Ryle and Dr. Anthony Hewish shared the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1974 for the discovery of quasars and radio astronomy activities. I was specifically a student of both of these gentlemen, and in fact my research project was part of a research project that led to the discovery of pulsars. After graduating with obtaining a PhD, I worked at California Institute of Technology for several years, discovering a lot of quasars, collaborating with some of the top scientists there. I'm only telling you this not to blow my horn, but to establish a little bit of credibility, because as I say, nobody will want to hear what I'm going to say. But there was a former governor of the state of New Hampshire, Walter Peterson, who had the courage to say it. He said it publicly. He said it in an interview with the Peterborough Transcript. And each year in Peterborough they award a medal to somebody who exemplifies his courage. But not a single person there that I've talked to has had the courage to take up. Nobody in the establishment has had the courage to look at what he said and pay heed to it. Because this is the darkest thing in our country. For the last 11 years, I have studied with a group of international scientists the events on 9/11. And I can say to you, without any reservation, you can have my degree if you want it. They can take it away from me if they want it. I don't care. The buildings in New York on September 11th, 2001 were destroyed by controlled demolition using explosives. The Twin Towers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wyndham, for giving us your background, but we're discussing a particular bill, 1773, in regards to the financing of political campaigns. And I'm just going to ask that you get
okay,
to that.
well, I won't say anything more because I know nobody wants to hear this. I'll just say one thing. The reason I'm telling you this is because the speakers here have brought out the fact that we are not a democracy. We are a flawed democracy or an oligarchy. And I just wanted to say one word about that. We are also a delusional democracy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wyndham. I do not have any more pink cards on 1773. I do have a couple of blue sheets, so if people will bear with me, I will read into the record the individuals who have not spoken but have signed in with the position to this. Senator Fuller Clark, in favor. Representative Werner Horn, in favor. Liz Tentarelli from the League of Women Voters, in favor. Sherry Frost, representative, in favor. Representative Nodder, opposed. Representative Reed, in favor. Kyrie Kaplan from Concord, in favor. Stephen Rand, representative, in favor. Representative Hinch, opposed from the majority office. Patricia Higgins, representative from Grafton, in favor. Diane St. Germain from Center Barnstead, in favor. Olivia Zink from Open Democracy Action, in favor. Elizabeth Correll from Concord, in favor. Jean Lightfoot from Open Democracy, in favor. Sally Hatch of Concord, looks like maybe Keene State College, in favor.
Is that KSC?
KSC, yes.
Howard Kent State Coalition. Or Kent Street, sorry, Kent Street Coalition.
Oh, thank you for the correction there. Laura Aronson, I believe, from Manchester, in favor. Stephen Kuglowski from Derry, in favor. Lester Cupp from Open Democracy, in favor. Joellen Cupp, in favor. From Stratham, Susan Carr from New Boston, in favor. Jackie Gallant from New Boston, in favor. Gary Gallant from New Boston, in favor. Kathy Cahill from Concord, in favor. Maureen Ellerman from Concord, in favor. Susan Coble from Kentucket, in favor. Louise Spencer from Concord, in favor. Ruth Heath from Canterbury, in favor. Ruth Stewart from Sandwich, in favor. And Richard Stewart from Sandwich, in favor. Ron Bilton from Canterbury, in favor. No, Ginny Littlin from Canterbury, in favor. Are you all here? Because I just, it looks like maybe perhaps spouses, and I just cremated their names, and I apologize. I didn't realize they were even married till I got to the address, and so are they. Harriet Katie from Deerfield, opposed. Nancy Dewey from Bristol, in favor. Mary Till, in favor. Representative Stone, opposed. Jack Jonas, in favor. Melissa Heinbach, in favor. Sally Emily from Webster and Open Democracy and New Women Voters, in favor. Wendy Abbott from Milton, in favor. And Roger Bosky from Farmington, in favor. So that concludes the public hearing on 1773. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Committee members, it is now 5:01. We are way behind schedule. We have not, pardon me?